it's not precise. The great thing about editing is that you can delete, try again, do it all over again, throw it out, take one thing from the other. It's like, there's a different way to do my job. Like, there's a more serious way, but it's not me, and I think that's the most important thing, is to just like, do you.
Welcome to Wider Lens, a podcast brought to you by the Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario. In this episode of Wider Lens, we sit down with DGC Ontario picture editor Matt Hannam. Matt's career has spanned from indie art house films like Swiss Army Man and Enemy to cerebral horror like Possessor and It Comes at Night. His latest feature is director Noah Baumbach's 80s set black comedy White Noise, streaming on Netflix December 30th. Hailing from Winnipeg, Matt came up through the ranks collaborating with iconic Winnipeg filmmaker Guy Maddin. Since then, he's worked with the likes of Denis Villeneuve, the Daniels, and Brandon Cronenberg.
It's usually there in the script, but sometimes you have to look a little deeper for how to get the script onto the screen, because it might take a little bit of invention.
Join us as we explore how editors' intuition can complement a director's tone and style, why Matt vibrates towards these distinctive voices, and how he's built an international career as a result of his creative chemistry with some of the most interesting directors working today. I don't think a lot of people know about the long history of artistry in film that's come out of Winnipeg, which is where you came from. But there is a very strong and important part of our heritage of indie filmmaking that have had, quite a strong presence around the world that have come out of Winnipeg. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I definitely didn't know that when I was growing up there. Obviously, it's Guy Maddin. That's the sort of the big thing. But when I started going to film school, there was this guy, Sean Garrity, who was sort of like the hot filmmaker in Winnipeg at the time. And he was a real mentor for me. I started as an actor, or an aspiring actor, a never successful one. And I met Sean because he cast me in a film, but my first year of film school, I went to go see his movie Inertia, which was sort of a really popular movie. And Sean's movies were very much rooted in like an improv theater world. And that was something that I was doing at the time. And so I was really interested in that. And Guy's stuff was really rooted in this sort of impressionistic, wild Soviet cinema style. And then at the time, there was a guy named Gary Yates who made a movie called 7 Times Lucky, and Steve Cousins shot that. That was sort of like one of his earlier features. And there was always a lot going on in Winnipeg. There was always movies shooting there. And the local filmmakers were really tightly wound. We all worked on each other's stuff. And when I started film school, I also joined the Winnipeg Film Group, which was sort of Guy Maddin's home and home to a lot of the experimental filmmakers and a lot of really amazing people. And there was these two bodies, Winnipeg Film Group and like Ace Art, and then there was like a video collective that I can't remember the name of, that was part of it. And I remember, like, in college or university, I just showed up and I was like, "Hi, I'd like to learn how to edit video. Do you have video editing facilities?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, we do." And that's sort of the amazing thing about being from a small place like Winnipeg that has a real local scene. It's not like anyone was showing up and being like, "Oh, like, I'm going to Hollywood in Winnipeg." It's like, that was Toronto for Canadian movies and Vancouver for American movies. But for me, that wasn't within reach. And I think that's what Winnipeg is really. And there's plenty of people who did come there to work on these movies. And so we all kind of taught each other how to do it. And there was a lot of generosity. So, working on Guy's movie as a camera assistant led to me then working as a script supervisor on one of his movies, which led me to being an assistant, and then they let me cut some stuff on on that movie, and then I worked on a bunch of guys stuff on like, moving forward until like I did. My dad is 100 years old was my first project with him, and then my Winnipeg and Cowards Bend the Knee and all that stuff. Just like no one really knew how to do it, and that's what makes it so special. Like guy had made this movie, and he didn't really have a script, so he came in and we watched the footage with the editor, who was my other main mentor, John Gerdebeck, and he just wrote the script on like a pad of paper that I had in the office, and I still have it. Like it's a really unique environment, and Guy's work goes back to, I don't know when he started. I mean, it must have been late 80s or 90s. Um, made a lot of films in Winnipeg, and because everyone who worked on movies either worked on these sort of inbound projects, like like whatever TV movies or projects that we're shooting there. So you kind of learn how to do it, but then so you have all these pro crews working on these insane films that are being generated from the very siloed artistic creative community, and everyone sort of works together. We would all these workshops where we would hand process the film in like paint buckets and shoot on sound stock and then hand process it and animate it. Like there was this guy Mike Marinek who would teach these workshops, and we would make these movies, and the music was being made by all the people who were doing in the great bands there, and you were there with Marcel Zama's people making costumes for Guy, and it was a community. And also the ballet is another thing that you have to factor into it, because a lot of the actors in Winnipeg were from the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, which is a huge ballet. And so one of my most important jobs was a camera assistant for this guy Saul Nagler, who was an amazing filmmaker, like experimental filmmaker. I think he's now a professor. And he worked with this like really wild cinematographer. I can't remember his name. He was a really talented guy. And that's where they'd be like, hey, we should cut some stained glass and make like a 5x6 filter and shoot through stained glass. Let's do that. And then you're doing it. I'll never forget it. It's just the best years.
I was on one of those inbound projects on my first experience in Winnipeg when I was still working as an AD, and it was when Guy was shooting Twilight of the Ice no, of the Ice Nymphs,
Mm.
and everybody had talked to me about Guy Madden, and I knew a little bit about him. But one night, the crews would play basketball together at RAP.
Mhm.
Guy's crew and our crew, we were doing the Avro Arrow, and we would all go to the warehouse where he had built this magical forest inside this old warehouse where they were shooting the movie. And it was like walking into a fairy tale. Like, it was absolutely, to me, it was like, this is some kind of magic that I've never experienced in the film industry, to my, limited knowledge in Toronto. And I know a lot of people from there. Carmen Arndt, who came from Winnipeg, who was a photographer before becoming one of the best, line producers that I ever worked with, and John Pays at the Film Center, and Greg, and like all of those people that came out of
Yeah.
the Winnipeg Film Group and the experimental films that were made out there. There's a very, very strong, and I think the isolation of Winnipeg, being in the center of the country, sort of not a destination necessarily on everybody's book for culture. Everybody was trying to get to Toronto or Vancouver. And I think it really created this hotbed of people that could experiment and do things and really try different ways of working. And I think it's kind of a wonderful place, fertile. I'll never forget the
I mean,
smell of Twilight of the Ice Nymphs forest, but
yeah.
that fecund swamp smell.
Yeah, it's disgusting. It always is gross. Like I remember
Yeah.
one day on a Guy film, I was a camera assistant, and there was all these horses that he had brought in. It's like, oh my God. Like there's horses shitting in the studio, and there's like a luchador family wrestling, and then like, oh, there's an you look on the call sheet and it's like they swim underwater. I'm like, how are we gonna do the underwater scene, you know? And then they roll in an aquarium on a cart, and they have a guy on an apple box pretending to swim, and it's like it's just amazing, you know. And it didn't matter. Like that was the Pays thing that was incredible. Is Pays was already gone. Pays, I'm sure, is the guy who let me into the film center when I was 24, and he was such a hero of ours. And like Crime Wave was a movie that you watched right away. And Pays, I remember there was a scene in one of his shorts, I think, where it's like there's a line of guys shaking hands, like doing business deals and stuff. And someone told me like, yeah, Pays, they didn't have money for shirts. So they had two shirts in the foreground, and then everything was out of focus. They just stapled printer paper around their wrists to be shirt cuffs, you know? And there was like this legend that Pays had duct taped a camera to a car because they didn't like they had an NFB camera and he like drove over it or something. It's like those are the things that make you realize anything's possible, and it's not always necessarily safe, but you kind of have to dream big when you have no money, because like if you're not weird and you're low budget, what are you? You're just cheap, right? So you kind of have to be adventurous.
I will say, cut to 1 month ago, being on a project where there was a very high level of expectation and not enough money to necessarily achieve that expectation. And my roots as an independent filmmaker and as somebody who did a lot of low budget stuff starting out as a director, and I had a very amazing cinematographer, French cinematographer, Renaud Caparo. And I said, I'm going to go down to the Marché aux Puces on the weekend. Do you want to come with me? And we went and bought a bunch of crystals and a bunch of crazy refracted glass, and we taped it onto the front of the camera. We did some stuff that the visual effects guys were like, we don't even know how you did this. We can't even make this. We can't even do
Yeah.
this. This looks so
Yeah.
magical. And I said, oh man, that was so great. Like it just felt like we were doing something really artistic and taking real risks, but saying, hey, listen, this is what we used to do. This is what we did when we had no money. We were creative, right? And we had no limitations. It was the limitation of our creativity was the only thing that we would stop us at that point in time. And I think that, having that imprint so early on and that environment obviously led you do you think that led you to search out those kind of directors once you started to become an editor? Was that probably part of that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that happens when you are making films where it's not really that important which part of it you're doing, like what your job is, you're just there doing it. Like the first feature I edited, I was the assistant director. And I was only the assistant director because there was already a cinematographer, which is what I thought I wanted to be. And they were like, "Did you want to be the AD? We need one." I was like, "Yeah, I'll be the AD." And then I did that, and I think what I was doing was more like directing, because the director was the actor, but it didn't matter. It was just myself and this guy Keith Ides, and we were 21, and we were making this movie for $5,000 that the director and writer and star made at the Red Lobster, you know, and and then I, as a waiter, not like he was hustling people at the Red, but and so we were, and then when I moved on, well, I didn't move on, but like when I just kept traveling through my career, I always just sort of sought out projects where I could be more creatively involved. And I like editing, and I continued editing, but I think the directors were always people who were like open, and when I came to Toronto, I went to the film center, and my first job was on a Bruce McDonald movie, who was a hero of mine. And then I started working with McKellar, and those two guys come from the same school. It's like, well, we're just doing this, and you're gripping it, and you're shooting what you can and doing stuff. And my perspective on editing is that it's like you have to, obviously you have to have a certain facility with the computer, but really it's like I try to think about the word in a bigger sense, where you're editing the movie and you're trying to figure out what it is that they're trying to say. And so for me, the directors that I wanted to work with were people who were open to being creative in the editing room, and working with the material in ways that is, you know, the best for the film that they shot, and not so much like, well, we should start in the wide and do this. And like, not a lot of people do that anymore, but I always wanted to do more. Like, for me, the material always felt more plastic, you know. Um, and I love doing that with a cut, sort of like looking at what you have, looking at what you don't have, and figuring out like, how can we do it. I think that you find like-minded people, you work with people who want to do the same thing you do, and that's probably why I haven't done like a lot of things that anyone really wants to see, but it is like, I I love, like, I always think like my films are for, for filmmakers and film lovers, and it's not like a lot of people want to see something like Vox Lux every day, but out of the blue, I'll get a call and say, like, that's my favorite. I love that movie. And that, for me, that's like really exciting if I can just make these make art with movies, and meet these people and do these things. And so, yeah, I think that I do seek that out. I do seek out the space to sort of get a little experimental or fun with it, and be flexible with what my job is on the movie.
This brings us to sort of the heart of the collaboration and the alchemy between the director and the editor. I think there's a lot of mystery and misinformation, I would like to say, about what an editor does and what an editor is. And I think a lot of times people think, yes, there's the construction of storytelling. There's the construction of us putting a scene together or finding a scene. But beyond that, um, I think that to me, it's always been a mystery. I know now I meet a lot of young filmmakers who are like, oh, I'm going to edit my own film. And I'm like, I know, and then I'm gonna watch it and I can tell you edited it. But that's a whole other conversation. But, because they think they can run the software program, that's editing. And I try to explain to them, but I'd love to hear your take on that. There's so many other things that have gone into it. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about what you think, um, you know, what you feel you bring to a project.
Yeah, I mean, like, I bring everything I've got, and I think that's the point. One of the main things that's different for an editor and a director, like, let's say you're a feature film director primarily. Maybe you get to make a movie every 10 years, like, or Tar, 16 years after Little Children. And the reason that I've never pursued like a real direct line in my career is I like bringing everything to it. I like that I have made documentaries and comedies and commercials and action and whatever, lots of sad drama stuff. But I think, cinema, like, the big idea of cinema is that you're making like a piece of work inside the frame, right? And when you do that, there's no way, and it's always going to be generated from a script, some kind of document that's going to guide the crew and the actors to record the scenes that you are then going to fashion into a movie or a film or a show or whatever. So when you do that, it is never going to go as planned. Like, absolutely never will it just be exactly what you thought. And sometimes it is, and there's people who cut their own stuff that are good at it, and there's some people that are bad at it. Like, some of my favorite Van Sant movies he cut himself, and Sean Baker cuts his movies himself. But for them, I believe it becomes a part of their process because they want to they have that unique skill to edit their stuff themselves, because I think that they collect differently. And so for me, what I bring to the process is a point of view where I look at your screenplay and I look at the footage that we have, and I try to make and I talk to you. I talk to you about what you want it to be, and then we make that movie in the software, you know. Um and what we bring into it has absolutely nothing to do with a computer. Like it's just a way to organize the pictures. And so what I think you bring into it, and like, this is, everyone references it, but Murch's books are kind of the Bible for it. Like the reason that his stuff is so heady and whatever is that he's a smarty pants. Like he's looking at poetry and all this stuff, and so his editing is very much about that. I love I love the expression of the images, and I love a very intoxicating pace in my work. And for me, the best way that I've figured out how to describe what I do is I like to make the movie embody the character. I like a movie to be cut in the way that the character is feeling, and oftentimes you are imposing that on him or her, as, or or it's generating it, and so you kind of have to look at, like, does the cutting propel this film, or does the character propel the cutting, or does it have anything to do with it at all? Because if it's a very like rigorous like Hanukkah thing where you step back and you're just watching it, then that's really challenging to cut. And people don't think that, like you look at the Oscars every year and it's like, well, how many edits in a film generally means how many nomination chances they have. It's like, I just, for me, the hardest thing that you can do is a slow paced film and keep it interesting, because shots have an expiration date, but often if the milk goes bad, if you wait long enough, you get yogurt, and yogurt's delicious. And so for me, it's like you can cut right away or you can wait. And if you wait too long, then you cut, it's not going to work because it's going to feel like off beat or off the rhythm of your scene. But then if you keep waiting, then you're going to keep looking at the shot and think, well, I wonder what else I'm supposed to see. And then they're going to look deeper into the image. And that requires a set of eyes that is removed from the creation of it, because sometimes those long shots or short shots or quick pace scenes aren't going to work because it didn't work out that way. And or the character is supposed to do something for the movie and they're not doing it. Like it's not working. Like, for instance, the movie Enemy was a very interesting experience for me because the book and the script, the characters, the female characters, like it's about a guy, for those who haven't seen it, it's about a guy who is trying to decide between his mistress and his pregnant wife, and he's having like a crisis as a father, as in, potential father. Will I stay or go? And like, did I make a mistake because I have this girlfriend? And the girlfriend in the script was like a really warm, like loving person, and the wife was sort of like a ball and chain type character. But the casting with like Sarah Gadon being the mother was very warm, and Melanie Laurent was she was a bit like meaner to him in the way that she did it. And Denis and I, when we were cutting the movie, we kind of had to realize that the characters were telling us something different than the script was. And we had to cut it different. Like we had to change the way that we were cutting the movie and change the weight of certain sequences, because if you didn't cut it different, then it wouldn't make sense why he's trying to leave this great wife that he has for a relationship that's not really working. So we had to rework the movie. So he kind of had to get out of his relationship that he didn't want to be in and able to go, because he'd gone too far. He'd gone too far with the other woman. And that's the type of thing that I think editing is. It's about realizing what you have and making that movie with the material that you've got. And also looking at the movie in advance and saying, like, what are we doing here? What do we need? Is there anything that we can add? Like just to yesterday, I was having a conversation with the director I'm working with, and I was like, man, I don't know if we have enough footage for what we were talking about here. And he's like, yeah, but I was thinking we could do something different. And then we had this idea, like, why don't we try shooting it off of like 3 or 4 different televisions after it's cut? And instead of trying to do it this way, we can cut between all these scenes where we have it on TVs. I don't know if we're going to do it, but that's not really editing, but it is, and that's the thing that I love doing, is just figuring out how we're going to tell the story and helping to do that.
Enemy was such a powerful film for me. I didn't realize until I watched it again today, and I first of all, it's incredibly prescient about so many things. I was like struck by it is a profound example of creating a compelling character through editing and imagery because there's no dialogue, you know, and sound design and music. The score is so astonishing. And it had a really, really profound effect on me as a filmmaker when I saw it for the first time. And it was such a distinct look. Everything about it was so specific. Um, and it was the jump cutting, just like everything not being linear. You know, you felt unsettled as a viewer, but
Mm-hmm.
you couldn't turn away. The camera staying too long on certain moments where nothing, you felt like nothing was happening. But as a director, I talk about it a lot with young actors, and I always tell them that they should watch it because you can't not watch him and Melanie Laurent and Sarah. It's so
Yeah.
interesting. It's almost forcing you to slow down and observe. Um,
Yeah, it's a really bizarre movie in its fabrication. And we did it was a very, very, very fulfilling and creative experience cutting it, because it it was a large part of it we did in editing. A lot of it were ideas that we had, because Denis was in a very unique place, because he had just been nominated for an Oscar, and he was going to go do Prisoners, and he had money to make Enemy, and it was a good budget, and he had a great cast, and it was all sets mostly. And so it was kind of like this lab, and there was a lot of extra footage. And um so the cutting of it, I was there was we were able to do like another layer of generative filmmaking. We were able to create ideas out of footage that wasn't being used, because it was this sort of salon where they would just be shooting, and I remember being on set. There's a great moment when um it's in the apartment when Jake was watching the um movie on his laptop. I was on set for some reason, and we were talking, and someone just was like, shh, and I realized they were rolling. And there was this sort of communication between Jake and Denis and Nico, the DP, it was just like they were always working. There was never a moment when they weren't working. And if there was something they found, they would shoot it. And that was sort of the edit too. And I was quite young, and didn't have anything else that I cared about. And so, I would go home and work at night, and I would come to the office the next day, and I did this, and the opening of the movie, there was a different opening for the movie, and Denis was like, I think we need a different opening. Can you come up with something? And it was like he would issue these challenges, because he would have the guy is such an, I mean, we don't need to talk about how good he is. um and but the thing that's really cool about him is he never needed to have the idea. Sometimes challenging you for because he had ideas, but he would often be like, "What? See what you can come up with." And there was some amazing creative juice that came from that. Like the opening of the movie is hair and makeup tests, and that's what we used, because I had them, and they were amazing. And so then they're like, I remember we were at dinner somewhere, and we're like, oh, we should get a voicemail. Like there's like, I was thinking about voicemails, and so we got Isabella Rossellini to like call and record a voicemail. And then you have this new scene that sort of was only generated by the movie editing. And we're like, it'd be great to fill out that feeling, is the idea of like not picking up your mom's phone call because there's something wrong and you can't face her, you know? And we did it. And it was like, it's like, your palette is just expanded when you have a creative partner like that, you know. um no, that was the rarest of experiences.
And I think we've touched on this, but I think that like directors and writers, um, editors sometimes, I'm sure, get pigeonholed into genres or
Hmm.
styles, etc. And once again, I think this goes to the heart of not understanding that at the end of the day, we may have an affinity for certain genres, or because that's our voice, and we like uh, to do things in certain, we're drawn to certain types of storytelling. But I think that at the very end of it all, we're just all storytellers. We're just trying to create some kind of truth. I think that what I'm getting at is like, I think you have an unusual way of explaining what you call your agnostic style. And I think we've talked a little bit about it in the creative process, but maybe you can just say how you approach a movie. Like,
Hmm.
what do you when you're involved in a project, what is that initial spark, and how do you then, move forward in the project?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the creative juice comes from movies themselves, and so I often try to think about what we're doing, and then and I try to think about other movies, and then I watch a lot. Like I like to do references, and they're not always going to match, you know. But like for Enemy, I really was watching a lot of Antonioni because I liked the way that he dealt with space and time, and so that was something that I wanted to apply because I felt okay. What is in history of cinema? What do I think like we're most like what are we edging towards here? And I felt something drawing me towards Antonioni. And there's nothing about Enemy that is going to remind you of Antonioni. But what it does is it allows me to sort of pick up on something in the film to play with. And because it was not a real story, like because it wasn't set in reality, I needed something to loosen me up and give me an infrastructure to work in. And so then I came up with this idea because I think Antonioni is like a lot of representation. I was like, okay, I'm going to come up with a story for the movie and I'm going to do that. And the style sort of came from that. And we were looking at music and like, what is the music of this movie? Like not necessarily the score, but what is it? And there's a lot of groaning, and Denis and I had these pieces like, a weird live John Zorn concert and some Colin Stetson saxophone from like the, early albums that he was making. And these were things that were fueling us. And that's one way that I look at it, is like, picking a reference, not so much for like, let's do this, like let's do this kind of movie. It's more, what's the framework here? What's the cinematic framework? What's the language? And then the other thing is to, there's no not corny way to say this, but you just have to, for me, I have to let the movie speak to me and play with it. I am lucky that not a lot of directors that I work with want to see like a first, like they don't want scenes delivered that day. They don't want to see like a rough assembly and then edit that. They want to work with, most of the directors I work with, we build it from scratch together. So my assembly time is totally experimental. And so when I'm assembling, I'm doing a lot of sound design. I'm listening to a lot of music. I'm cutting scenes. I'm looking at how scenes are going together. And that starts to sort of tell me how this movie, like how flexible it is, and how pliable the material is. And with Enemy, I sourced inspiration from the camera movement. And the camera rig that they had that worked so well was handheld, a handheld rig hung upside down on a jib on a dolly. So they could drive around and move the camera and pick it up. And so I was like, okay, well, what's the editing version of that? Like let me have that as an inspiration. And the editing version of that is a sort of gooey, like time's not real. The reality of this movie some sort of like bendy, and so I try to cut it that way. And that's how I started layering all the dialogue all over each other and doing scenes like there was a dream sequence where he has like this dream of the hotel that was very central. And I one day I just showed Denis, instead of playing the scene where they're like, "Hi, would you like your hotel room order?" I was like, I got this really insane music and just cut it silently. And I was like, how does a dream feel? Like a dream feels wrong. It doesn't feel like a scene. It feels wrong. And so, that became the way to do it. And in other movies, like there's this film I did that I'm really proud of called James White. And that was one where the the character dictated the style. The character was a sort of interior looking at the ground in front of him. And so there was and just trying to get by day. So the days had to feel like really confusing. You just had to like wake up sometimes and you're just going. And then long stretches will pass, or a scene when you have to be present because the character's never present. We did this long take where we were supposed to shoot. He was talking about how he's going to be a father and move to Paris, and his mom's going to die of cancer. And we were going to shoot Paris. And then when we were cutting it, I one of my jobs as the editor is to remember what it's like to see the footage for the first time, because I'm the only one who ever gets to do that. And I cried really hard when I was watching the dailies because it was such a moving performance. And it led to us deciding to not cut into it and to not cover it because we decided that it was worth it. And it was, because it was an honest moment in a character's life who's always moving and couldn't get away from the reality. But then when the reality is in front of him, he has to stop. And so that was the cutting style of that, like pop, 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 and then pause and hold it real long because it's real. And then you end up with something like White Noise, which is every genre in one. You got to see it, right?
Yeah, I watched it today.
It's
Yes.
it's like it's that's a movie that's about movies. It's like a movie about people acting like they're in a movie. And so we got to do noir because he is acting like he's in a noir. And it never says it explicitly, but that's like all of them are like making decisions based on how people would act in a fiction. It's not real. You don't just like do these things. And so that's we got to do like 80s adventure Spielberg thing. We got to do 80s color noir. Like I watched Thief a bunch, and we would draw frames in pre-production. Did a lot of storyboarding. Shots from Thief, there's shots from Close Encounters, there's shots from ET, but then there's also just like people talking in a room, and that is just as exciting because you can do drama, you can do adventure, you can do like Jurassic Park was my model for the creek sequence, and there's nothing about Jurassic Park, but I wanted it to feel that way. And then it's also the vacation movies with like, why don't we run a whole scene over a wide that they probably would have done in voiceover back then, but let's do it. And so what you're doing is you're drawing on history to invoke a feeling that allows you to feel a certain way. So I think I try to taste the fruit and figure out what I'm going to make with those ingredients.
It feels like the rhythm and cadence of the film finds you in a kind of organic way, which I think is always really beautiful and authentic. You said something in an interview which I thought was really powerful, and I want to just share it because I think to all the directors listening out here, this is probably the mystery and the magic. And I got to work with John in Winnipeg on a project last year. He cut a film for me, and it
Mm-hmm.
was such a beautiful experience because I was like, well, why don't we try this? And he was like, okay. And we had this it was a very, specific TV project, but we took a lot of risks and we did a lot of really creative things. And it was a real joyful experience for me. So I can understand him being a mentor of yours. And having such a big influence on you. He was really
I mean,
great.
the man is a genius.
Yeah.
Like, and that's a guy, I want to hear what I may have said, but that's a guy who came from performance art, right?
Yeah.
And he didn't understand why people didn't want to make things into art. And that was something that I took from him. He was like, there was no rules with him. Everything was material for the thing. And I just, I have unlimited respect and adoration for that guy.
Well, this was what you said, and it was partly about John Gerdebeck, right? That's his, yeah.
Yeah,
And
I think
and
that's
he- and he said, you said about him, he showed me to treat footage like raw material and to be unafraid of making something new or unintended if it feels good for the film. I feel you can always go through the footage and cut the scene as it was intended, but you never get a chance to see it for the first time again. So when I watch dailies, I try to just take them in and then assemble the scene based on whatever I saw that made me feel the most. That could be a great camera move or a specific moment of performance. If the actor did something incredible in a particular setup late in the scene, I'm going to try to build the scene towards that. So I'll choose shots based on some sensible progression towards that moment. Whatever it is that is most striking, I focus on that and work backwards. And I love that for so many reasons because I think that that is something that we forget about. We forget that in the work that we do, hopefully, there is a moment where the intention that you had, or some sub intention that you don't even know yet, um, reveals itself
mm-hmm.
as a director, whether it's through performance or through a camera movement or, you know, I love relationships with cinematographers that I have where I can say, I need something that makes me feel lonely. Give me a shot that I need the lonely shot. And they're like, okay. And they
Mm-hmm.
know what I'm talking about because we have a language. They know what I'm
Yeah,
talking about and how, and I want the camera to be something also that makes the audience feel something where the camera
yeah.
is. And I think that that is a really profound statement. And I hope that every director that's listening and editors that are listening and everybody else takes out away from that. Um, what you said
I mean,
there.
that is, I mean, I don't know. I like, that's great. I mean, I feel like,
It
I
is
mean,
great.
it's what you do, right? Like the first time I worked on a movie with dailies was a TV movie for that guy Gary Yates that I mentioned. An editor from London took me on. I didn't have any experience. I lied to get the job, and I said I knew how to use Avid, and I didn't. And I just figured it out. And I mean, that was all Buffalo gals who were just like the supporters of mine that I just, I don't exist. My career doesn't exist without Phyllis and Liz because they just supported me. They were the ones that said, yeah, he could probably do it, And that movie was, I don't know what year. It would have been like 2003. Um, we were getting our dailies on Beta SP, and the way that you use to digitize your dailies is by recording them from a tape deck into your computer, right? And so I would sit there with the editor and we would watch the dailies come in, and I try as best I can to replicate that every time I make a film, because there is something about, you're on set. I mean, set's terrible. It's so exhausting. It's like you're like eating an old cheese sandwich and your feet hurt and like it's hot and everything is a problem. And sometimes you can lose sight of how great it is, what you're doing, what you're getting, or you can be like, you can circle a take and be like, that's the best take, you know, because it was what you were working on. And then you do another one and it's like, let's move on. That's not as good anymore. Or you missed the first one. But so for me, it's like the symbolism of removing whatever happened between each take It's only when the camera was rolling and watching that in a string, you see the creative and intellectual progression of the shoot day and of the movie. And so when you sit there every day and watch an hour or two of whatever the footage, like however much footage they got, you can see your director working. You can see their brain working, and you can see the actors working, and you can see. I think when I'm thinking about a certain scene when I said that thing, because it wasn't working for a while, and then it starts working, and then you have to do it again and again and again and again. But you may have not done it on the other side of the scene because you didn't get it yet, and then you have to be really creative about how to incorporate that. And so, for me, it's about capturing this. It's about capturing the magic. It's about like tying your rope around the thing that is the best in the scene and the best thing in the movie, and making sure that you use all the material to support it to its maximum potential. And sometimes you can get caught up on things that seem integral and basic to the film, like some of the structure of this movie is this, but it might not actually be, because it may have not worked as good as the other thing. And while you always have, like, it's usually in the script, it's usually there in the script, but sometimes you have to look a little deeper for how to get the script onto the screen, because it might take a little bit of invention, you know
So let's talk about your process and when you're working on a project. I know that you love to come on, obviously, at the very beginning. This was something I learned on my very first film. I had some really wonderful mentors, and they said to me, bring your editor on long before you go to camera, have deep conversations with them. You know, they can help guide you and help the creative process. So maybe you could talk a little bit about. I just watched The Nest, which I have to say was like watching a slow moving emotional train wreck. But I could not take my eyes off the screen either. I was like, it's a beautiful movie
Thanks.
on
I
so
love that
many
movie.
levels, on so many levels. And I would have probably never found it had I not been doing this interview with you today. And now I'm going to recommend it to everybody because it's really a
Thank
work
you.
of art. Please tell the director, because I know you're working with him again. Please tell him
Yeah.
how much of a work of art I thought it was.
I will.
And very accessible, like in a way that was like it was way more compelling dramatically, and not just, I don't want to say entertaining because that's not the word, but you wanted to keep watching even though you were I was such a ball of like anxiety for the majority of it. um and I loved the ending. It was a great
Thanks.
ending.
Yeah, I love
um
it too.
yeah, so maybe you could just talk about your process with him and how that came to be, and how were you involved, et cetera, in throughout that journey to the screen.
Yeah. Sean's a friend of mine, Sean Durkin. I had worked with them. He produced James White. I was a really big fan of Martha Marcy May Marlene. The
Great film.
composers from Martha Marcy May Marlene were the composers for Enemy. Like, it's all a very tight knit thing. And I was really lucky that I got to go work with these guys who were sort of like my peer heroes. Um, so when we were making The Nest, we knew each other already. And I read a couple drafts. And for me, it's like the reason why I aspire to keep my relationships and keep working with directors is I think there is something invaluable in a continued friendship and professional relationship, because not only do you know how to remind them of what they started out trying to achieve, but you also know where it's coming from, and how they're going to make it. And the TV thing is something I was talking about for this movie with Sean, and the comfort that you have with a friend. Editing is so intimate. It's like you see more of them than you see of your family, and you have to trust each other, which is why I always tell people, like, don't try to work with people who aren't your people. Like, whatever you're doing is only going to be good if you're meant to be there. And I mean that in an emotional way, if it's your thing. And The Nest for me, it was Sean's very personal story. I first heard about the movie when we were cutting James White, and we went to London to go see him, and he was writing a horror movie about a film director who lived in England. And that turned into The Nest. And or maybe those were two films that turned that script, because we were going to make this movie about Janis Joplin and it ended up not happening. And they greenlit that script. Like they greenlit The Nest really quickly, and we were just doing it. And I knew what Sean had, and he changed the script. And so I think what's most special about my being a part of it early on is I knew it originally was a horror movie. And that's why it feels the way it does, because we took out the horror part of the movie, but we fashioned it after a horror movie, because the thing is them. And so that's why there's all those shots, and the sound design is all about something's watching you, and it was very distant or tight, and the characters were accessed in a way that is abnormal for a traditional movie. And so for me, like there's the basic stuff of reading the script and talking about cutting or adding scenes, which is like, something you learn. I think I've gotten better at it. I was really never good at it before. And, you know, um, with experience, you figure out what to say and how to gesture towards what you think without condemning things or like, it's got to be a positive process. I mean, I believe in everything being very positive because it's such a sensitive medium. Criticize someone, they like to stand up in front of a crew and say, this is what I think. You have to be putting on a show because no one's that confident. And so for me, I'm like, my position as editor is to be absolutely supportive. Because you are there, you see them at their most raw, right? And so I really want to be your family member. Like I want to be, and so when I'm reading the script, I try to look at it and talk about it and say, what are you trying to do here? What do you think about this? Do you think maybe we need this? Like there was a couple things that we added from in White Noise that I came up with because I had read the book and the script and I hadn't spent a year writing the script. And so I was talking to him about the book, and with The Nest, the drafts changed quite a bit from the time I first read it until later. I didn't like so for me it was just about talking about it with Sean, talking about what we were doing, having a place for him to talk about how he's going to shoot it. There was stuff that we came up with that he shot in a certain way because of not ideas that I had, but conversations that I had, like just yesterday we were talking about this movie, and I didn't necessarily know what I was thinking, but we were talking about the editorial style because we're shooting right now. We have a week left, and it's it's like a Greek tragedy sort of. And so what we were talking about was how it's going to cut. And I was talking about the way I've been playing with some scenes. I was like, hey, I tried this and it was really cool. Like I layered this scene on top of that scene. Someone's home. And he was like, yes, that's great. That's what I was thinking too. And so we had this idea. I was like, okay, and it's about consequences. The editorial style is about consequences. So scenes have to be always tumbling forward, and you have to layer it all on. You have to feel that the reason this happened is because of this. And so that is sort of going to be a thing where I think it's like, I think of it as a triangle, right? It's like you have everything and it's getting compressed and compressed and compressed. I'm doing for the audio version, I'm doing a very complicated triangle with my arms. Because when it's about consequences, you want to keep everything in the movie, right? And so that's actually making me think about music. It's making me think about having a really strong thematic element to the thing, because with music, a lot of times you're like, oh yeah, you have like Kevin's theme and Samantha's theme, and then you have the family and whatever, or you have one theme. And if you repeat the same theme over and over with different iterative qualities, you're always going to be thinking about the previous time you heard it. And so it helps me to start looking at how we're going to temp it. What are we going to do? What are we going to use material from before, later? And so you know, it's like script editing, but also just that blue sky creative space that I don't think can be as rich or fervent if you are just coming in and looking at the footage, because you only have the footage as source material. You don't have the conversations and the experience and the shoot and everything. So for me, it's really about just infusing myself with the idea, but removing myself from the pain and pleasure of production, because sometimes production can also be intoxicating. You can be like, I had so much fun doing that scene. We have to, we have to use it, With White Noise, there's a scene I spent a whole night second unit shooting, and we cut it in like 4 minutes because like it's too much for the sequence. And it's like the whole night of shooting, a whole night of my life on the road, I threw out in 1 minute. And you kind of have to be able to do that. But also you have to be able to say, remember, this was the idea. Remember, this is what we first talked about.
So let's go to Noah, because that's probably the film that's coming out now, right? It's just coming out, right? So let's talk about the White Noise experience. You, once again, and I think this is really intrinsic to the journey that you've been on, which is creating these friendships with directors, which I 100% believe in. I've always said to young filmmakers, find an editor that you love who challenges you and has, great creativity, and then please blow smoke up their ass for the rest of your career. That's what you should do with your creative partners, because they remind you of when you lose your way, of why, what you have to say, and how you have a unique way of saying it. And they find and elevate your work. I mean, that's just what they do. Great creative partners do. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about the White Noise Project and how that all came to be and working with Noah. Because I know that you guys also shot this on film, which I think is a rarity. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I got really lucky. My good friend Jen. I also believe in having colleagues. Like my editor community is so strong, and I think you'd agree. Like having director friends where you can talk about how it is to do what you're doing. It's important to me to learn from my peers and colleagues, and Jen is someone that I've known for a while. We went to go see Operation Avalanche, the Toronto movie, Matt Johnson's movie. We went to go see it together at Sundance, and we didn't really know each other that well, and we ended up sitting next to each other because I had a ticket and we hung out. And Jen had cut for some friends, and that was but we've just always kept in touch. We really liked each other, and we were cutting in the same buildings a few times. And it's someone that I admire. And Jen was busy on another project; she couldn't do his thing anymore, and so it came to me. I know he met other editors too, but I kind of I like that New York satirical literature, and he and I really hit it off when we talked, I guess. I mean, I didn't know at the time. It was 3 job interviews, and I was like, I hope I got it. But yeah, I mean, that one, it was a long relationship. We met, he hired me at the end of 2020, and we just finished the movie 2 weeks ago. So we talked about the script a bunch, we talked about the book a bunch, talked about wine a bunch. Like it's just about getting to know each other. And like, I'm also a big fan of shooting on film. I'm really lucky that a lot of movies I get to do are on film, and I love shooting film myself. So we talked a lot about the aesthetics, and we talked a lot about movies, and we would always text about movies and music. And that's the thing where like the score was influenced by this by some stuff I was listening to, and I texted it to him, and I was like, what do you think about like this for that kind of thing? And he's like, great. And then I cut the storyboards to that. And then it was our temp music. And he was like feeling Tangerine Dream a little bit for the movie. And and it was Harold Budd, the music that I was listening to. And so then, when we started working with Elfman, he made the music based on Tangerine Dream meets this Aaron Copland stuff that I'd cut that car crash montage to. And, that's like all, it's like no one's idea, and like, I think that's the best way that you can, when you look at a movie and you don't know whose idea it was, that's the best thing. Taking credit for things is kind of like, it's nice to know that you had a hand in creating something. But what I really love is looking at something and knowing that it was genuinely like a community concept. And that's something I learned from Don and Bruce. So anyways, the question is like with Noah, we worked a bunch. We did this amazing thing that I have never done before, where the first time I met him in person was maybe a month before we all moved to Cleveland to shoot the movie. All the department heads got together for a week in New York, and we had a boardroom / abandoned yoga studio. And we sat around and we did a page by page talk through, and everyone talked about every idea that they had for the scene. There was a TV, so you could show references. There was a storyboard artist drawing stuff for us. And it was just this like creative incubator where every idea that anyone had about color, costume, editing came out.
Right.
And it was all, there was like someone taking notes, and it was the most creative moment I've had in a movie, because you don't get to talk to the designer and the costume designer and the cinematographer about their ideas and about how we could cut it and what we could use, and pulling clips and stuff. And so that was like a really great part of it. And I think it just built from there. I was on set shooting with him. He likes to have an editor on the set sometimes, and so I spent time on set. Cinematographer is a good friend of mine, so that was a really fun thing, and so it was just a really collaborative, creative experience. And Noah shoots to cut. His ideas about how he's going to construct his shots have a lot to do with how he's going to cut them. And so we would talk about the shot list in the morning, and after work we would talk about the footage that I seen that day. And we just were talking today, and I just realized, we were talking about his next script, and it's the type, he's more inclusive than a lot of directors, because he that's how he works. He likes to really draw on every aspect of it to get his ideas for writing and shooting. But we never really talked about cutting, it was like we just kind of cut together, and he's like, what if it was like this, and what if we did that? And he would just sit with me all day, and I would just work. And sometimes we wouldn't talk about what I was doing, and sometimes he would tell me what to do, and he would want to see it. He's like, can I see it this way? And we had a luxurious schedule. We cut for a long time, so we got to know each other real well. And I don't know, it was just like a hard, long, great experience with a guy who really wants to cut his movie. And we made a lot of tough choices. We cut some really great material because it wasn't working for all the things that we've talked about. It was just not right for the movie. And so you have to trust each other. And I think that's the main thing in the cutting room, is to just trust each other completely and be willing to say something and be ready to be told that you're wrong or that they don't like your idea, and not take that personally. I think it took me about 10, 15 years to learn how to be wrong without feeling, but I already did it that way. Like, oh, all right, it's your movie, bro. Like, it's, it's like, that's not helpful, and it has nothing to do with you, It has nothing to do, to go back to that, it has nothing to do with whose idea wins. Best idea wins.
Yeah.
And it's not a win. The movie is the thing that has to win, so it doesn't really matter who does what or how it happens, as long as you get there,
And I think that goes to the heart of, understanding. I think what he did at the very beginning, which is really wonderful to hear, and I feel very envious of that, feels very much like what they used to do, like Sidney Lumet used to do, or like the directors in the 70s, when you had people come in early and you had those conversations and you dug in deep and everybody contributed. And also it's team building. You're laying a foundation for a creative process that can only go upwards, right?
Yeah.
That can only be built upon, which I think is a really important factor when team building is as an important part, like the choices that you make of your creative partners and your contributors and your collaborators is as important as the content,
Totally.
because it can have a complete, the outcome can be devastating if you pick the wrong people, or miraculous and more than you ever imagined if you pick the right people. Um, so I think that those are really important things for people to hear. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to talk about?
I don't know what I want to talk about. I mean, it's so hard to talk about editing. It's like
Well,
it.
it's like magic.
Well, yeah, it's like you do it, and it's like it's total experimentation, but you're supposed to think that it's like really intentional. And as I have done like you don't do a lot of interviews about this, and then if you have something that's kind of bigger, people want to hear about it. And so for me, it's like it's not precise. The great thing about editing is that you can delete, try again, do it all over again, throw it out, take one thing from the other. It's like, so for me, it's like I know a lot of people pride themselves in, there's a different way to do my job. Like there's a more serious way, but it's not me, and I think that's the most important thing, is to just like do you like whoever you are. And I'm not like a serious guy, and I really love movies, and I love playing around, and I like computers, I like sound. And so I work a lot on sound design. I do a really like, and it's not good. It's not like good enough to be done, but I like to make a really like intense, best as I can stab at a rough track that's going to inform how the movie feels, because my movies all are about sound. I love what a sound design can do for a film. I've never been one to like, and I would love to try it one day, because that would be another experiment for me. I would love to do nothing. I would love to do like just the dialogue track and let someone build it up. But that's like very hard to do, because I think part of my storytelling skill set is thinking about sound, because I have a passion for it. And I think that for me, as I slip into, uh, you know, inspirational speaker territory here, it's really about for me, it's about finding what you're best at sharing. Like, what is your best stuff that you can share, and try to build that up. Try to be like effective at the things that you're most capable of being effective at, and not try, like, because I used to always really want to get like a bigger movie, or this kind of movie, or like I want to do Batman, I want to do whatever. But it's like that hasn't come to me yet. And so I just try to follow the stuff that people seem to want me to do, because I know that I'm going to be able to do it. If they want me to do it, I'm going to do a better job, you know? And I've never been like, I always call it like the open market. Like I've just never done that. I've always just worked with people that I know or could know by, a degree or two. And that's because I'm a personal person. I'm a insecure, sensitive guy, and I don't really want to go out there and meet someone who I'm going to have a fraught relationship with, and they're going to be thinking about firing, or whatever. Like I want to have fun at work, and I want to be able to do something that I can feel is me. And so when I am trying to choose a project, I often weigh it heavily on a personal relationship, because I know I'll be able to do better work. And one of the big things that I walk away from a movie with is like, if you feel you didn't do it perfectly, it eats at me, because someone else maybe could have done it better, and that's like, that kills me, to think that like, if someone else had cut that movie, it may have been quote unquote better. I don't know that I have any of those, but I think about it. And so for me, it's like, yeah, I mean, I don't know what you even asked me, but that's how I feel about this. Is the most important thing is to find the person who can best access your skill set.
Well, I think that chemistry and alchemy is terribly underestimated, I would probably have to say, because people are like, well, we've got to get this big editor, or we've got to get this person, or you're a first-time director, so we have to get somebody who's like above here. And I said, no, you need somebody who you can spend because I love to be in the edit suite, and I think that's probably where directors learn the most.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of the most important experiences that you can have is to experience it, like to experiment while you're in there, to try things, to let somebody else try things, to listen to the conversations that are happening, and to recognize when you've made mistakes and say, oh, okay, that's very good. I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'll make a new mistake, of course, but I won't make
Mm-hmm.
that one again. Or,
Mm-hmm.
wow, really that worked, and I didn't know if it was going to. I took a risk on it. Um, I think those are really powerful lessons to have as a director, and you never stop learning. I mean, I always say that editors are kind of like the knitters,
Mm-hmm.
you know? You have all of these balls of yarn that are up in the air and bouncing around.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
ultimately, they're the people that can sort of take all of those elements and find some way to make a horrifying sweater or a comforting scarf.
Yeah. Is it
Yeah.
Argyle or is it Stripes? It's like there's different ways to do it. And yeah, but that is about your personal relationship, right? Because like I
Yeah.
was saying to Noah, we did this interview together today for White Noise, and most of the things we talked about were what we watched the night before. We'll be sitting there drinking coffee, and I'll be like, watch anything? He's like, yeah, I watched half of this, and I'd watch it, or I'd be like, I was thinking about this, and it's like that's the shit that's what gets your brain going, right? It's like you have to keep watching movies because I don't know. I just feel that it's really important to have them in you, and you never know what crazy movie is going to inspire an idea, you know. So you kind of just have to remain curious, and that's what I do. I just try to remain curious about what they think and ask the questions and see what it does to me.
I want to thank you so much for sharing in such an open way. I think that's really important. Um, and for also just for having a different way of going on this journey and for sharing that. And I think that's very empowering for people to hear. I always say go where you're wanted. Um,
Totally. That's
and
my
I
whole life.
Yeah. And I think that's just a really something that people forget about, like they're thinking, I should do this, or I should be on this, or I should do this. And I said, the the step in front of you is the one that you need to be engaged with.
Yeah.
And for reasons unknown, it will lead you to the next
Yeah.
adventure. And you have no idea. Sometimes when you're in the thick of it and it seems impossible and difficult, just know that there's a reason that you're in the thick of it. So I want to thank you for being such a lovely human being and
Thank you. Thanks.
such an
I
open
mean, I just
person.
like for me, it's like that's the only thing. If you try, I mean, I used to try to do it, but you're right. Go where you're wanted because then you're gonna have a better experience and you can do better work. And that's what we do. We got to do good work. Doesn't matter what it is. Like you can't look down on one thing because you think it's not what you should be doing. You never know. You never know what's going to be Moonlight or you know Everything Everywhere All at Once or any of these movies that are just like on fire out there. It's because people made them with a lot of passion, and that's all you can do.
Congratulations on all the success. And I look forward to the rest of the world seeing White Noise. And please go back and look at all the other movies too, because they're amazing. And I will see you in person. And congratulations on the family.
Thank you so much.
This podcast was produced by Katie Jensen and Michal Stein at Vocal Fry Studios. Our video producer is Mike Sherrill. Our executive producer is Anne-Marie Stewart. And special thanks to Aviva Cohen and Laura DiGirolamo at DGC Ontario. And I'm your host, Annie Bradley. We'll see you next time on Wider Lens. We would like to acknowledge that we are situated in Takaranto and are grateful to be working on this land. We acknowledge the land that we are recording this podcast on today is the colonized territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge that Tkaronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These treaties and other agreements, including the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We acknowledge and share our gratitude to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada, caregivers of the land, and keepers of its stories for thousands of years.